Ever wondered how the British Empire managed to maintain control over its colonies in Africa, even though they were greatly outnumbered by the people they colonized? The scramble for Africa took place between the late 1800s and the early 1900s, and yet Britain managed to maintain control over her African colonies well into the 1950s, or at least 1957, when Ghana became the first African country to gain independence. You want to know how they did it? Colonial police forces and colonial armies. Let's break it down, shall we? This is a podcast on African history, the idea of which came about as a result of my passion for the subject and a desire to share some of my expertise with like-minded people out there and anybody who might be interested in learning African history. So at this point, I'd like to encourage you to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell notification icon so that you can be notified every time we drop a new video. A little bit of background on myself. I'm an historian by training. I hold a PhD in history from the University of Calgary in Alberta, Canada. My research interests are civil aviation in colonial Africa, as well as British colonial police and militaries in Africa, with a particular focus on the colonial police in Botswana. At the time of filming this video, I have a few publications in these areas of interest and a couple more on other aspects of the history of Botswana. Now, this is not an attempt to say that I know everything there is to know, but I'm just trying to say that I do have a foundation and background on the things that I'll be talking about on this podcast, in case there are any questions regarding credibility and all that. Now, moving on to the content that will be discussed on this podcast. Naturally, based on my personal research interests, we're going to kickstart the show with a series titled Colonial Police and Military Forces. Now, one might ask why all this matters, why it's important to talk about colonial police forces and militaries. The short answer is, as I suggested at the beginning of this episode, that colonial police and militaries were vital in the formative years of colonization, and without them, the whole colonial enterprise may have never even succeeded. It was through these colonial police forces and militaries that Britain, just like other colonizers, managed to maintain a grip on her African colonies for as long as she did. Let me put it this way. The conquest and rule of African territories by European powers between the late 19th century and early 20th century were consolidated by the creation of paramilitary forces that were meant to act as agents of the colonial state, or, if you may, the coercive arm of the colonial state. These colonial police forces maintained foreign rule in African colonies, and they imposed unpopular policies among the Africans. State security, or colonial security, was the responsibility of these colonial police forces, and in some instances the colonial militaries, which often acted as a reserve. In most cases, colonial police forces and militaries were considerably small and depended on the participation of the colonized people to make up their numbers. The way I see it, studying these colonial police forces and militaries helps us to better understand British colonial rule in Africa. You see, some colonies had more economic significance to the colonizers than others, and this was sometimes reflected in the way that those colonies were policed. For example, in the much larger and more profitable colonies, including the white settler colonies that we'll talk about in this series, the police were involved in the collection of tax from African communities. The police were also heavily involved in securing low-paid wage labor for the colonial farms and mines. Even worse, the colonial police were involved in the displacement of African communities from their traditional agricultural lands and pushing them into impoverished reserves. Another thing to consider before we delve into the specific police forces is the model or the framework around which these colonial forces were created. You see, all across the British Empire during the 19th century, colonial police forces were not created along the lines of the local police forces in England, but were rather created around the model of the Royal Irish Constabulary. The Royal Irish Constabulary was a paramilitary police force that was created in 1822 to police Ireland during a time of unrest and resistance to British rule. The Irish model, as it came to be known, presented three characteristics that were vital for colonial policing that were not present in the police forces of Scotland or England in the 19th and 20th centuries. The first characteristic of the Irish model was the creation of a police force along military lines, and this was transplanted to the colonies. This is also where we get the term paramilitary. They were heavily armed, and you can understand why. They had to pacify the Africans and enforce a new political system, a new economic system, and a new legal system. The second characteristic was the centralized control of the police force as the official territorial security force. The conditions in the colonies, just as was the case in Ireland when the Irish Constabulary was created, necessitated the centralized control of the police forces as opposed to having different local authorities govern their police forces. The third characteristic of the Irish model was the housing of security personnel or policemen in barracks separate from the communities they were meant to police. In the colonies, the British even went as far as bringing men recruited from other regions or even other colonies. The recruitment of extraterritorial policemen was informed by martial races, which we will look at as we go on with the series. But a more practical reason was that having the policemen garrisoned away from the community they policed prevented them from developing sympathies for the people. So those were the three characteristics of the Irish model. However, as historian Richard Hawkins has said in his article about the Irish model and policing in the British Empire, the degree and application of the Irish model varied from colony to colony. But at least one of those characteristics was visible in the colonial police forces. I would even go as far as to say at least two of those characteristics were visible. The influence of the Royal Irish Constabulary on African colonial forces was very strong. In fact, many European members of the African colonial police forces received military training from the Royal Irish Constabulary and returned to the colonies with gazetted military ranks. Through the Irish model, colonial forces, or at least sections of them, could be organized into light infantry units that were sent out to quell insurrections and uprisings all over the colonies. In 1945, in the wake of the Second World War, the British government came up with new ideas and reforms on colonial policing. Though it happened at varying degrees and speed, colonial police forces began to shed their paramilitary features. They replaced their formerly coercive system of policing with a more consensual and civil style of policing. It goes without saying, though, that the military ethos of those police forces was not entirely abandoned. It was reserved for emergencies, so to speak. So all of this in its entirety, and of course other factors that went beyond colonial law enforcement, was how Britain managed to maintain control of her African colonies, even though the British security personnel and colonial administrators were greatly outnumbered by the Africans that they colonized. Remember though that these colonial police forces and militaries were considerably small and they depended on the Africans to sign up and make up their numbers. However, when Africans joined colonial police forces and militaries, their upward mobility within those forces was restricted. Which then brings us to the organizational structure of colonial police forces. Colonial police forces had a three-tier structure. At the top, there were the gazetted officers. In the middle, you had the non-gazetted officers or the inspectorate, and at the very bottom you had the rank and file, often called constables. Among the gazetted officers, there were ranks such as assistant superintendent, superintendent, senior superintendent, all the way to commissioner. For the non-gazetted officer ranks or the inspectorate, you had the assistant inspectors or sub-inspectors, you had the inspectors and senior inspectors, and sometimes chief inspectors as well. Among the rank and file, you had a combination of police and military ranks. There were constables, there were troopers, there were corporals, there were sergeants, and there were sergeant majors. So in the formative years of the colonial police forces and the militaries, Africans could only join up as rank and file. After 1945, however, again, with the changing attitudes on the part of the British officials, Africans began to make it into the inspectorate ranks or the non-gazetted ranks and ultimately into the gazetted ranks closer to independence. We will talk a little more about the Africanization of gazetted ranks as this series continues. At any rate, the advancement of Africans into the inspectorate ranks and ultimately the gazetted ranks happened at different paces or speed depending on the political developments in those colonies. In terms of scope, this series will cover West Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa in no particular order. Each episode will focus on one former British colony, tracing the history of its police force, exploring such topics as racial hierarchy, the conditions of service for both the black and white personnel of those forces, as well as notable events like operations and maybe uprisings that those colonial police forces were involved in suppressing. After looking at the various police forces, we will have 3 or 4 episodes looking at the colonial militaries in West Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa. In conclusion, I just want to say I'm excited for this Africa in Retrospect podcast, and especially to kickstart it with a series on colonial police and military forces. Once again, if this is the type of content you'd like to see or hear, consider subscribing to the channel. At the very least, give this video a thumbs up, comment, and share. I look forward to you joining me on episode 1, where we'll begin the series by looking at the police in colonial Nigeria. Until then, this has been Simon Bayani with Africa in Retrospect. Cheers for now.